Hello guys, and welcome to Planet Echoes. Imagine looking up into the night sky and seeing a stranger passing through, a pale traveller burning faintly, not born of our solar family, but drifting from the deeper reaches of interstellar darkness. It does not circle the sun as the planets do, nor follow the predictable path of known comets. Instead, it cuts across the vastness like an uninvited messenger, slipping briefly into our sight before vanishing again toward the void. The object was named 3IATLAS, the third recognised interstellar body to ever enter our system, and to many it seemed like nothing more than a fragment of ice and dust. But others wondered, what if it carried a meaning beyond its physical form? What if its presence itself was the message? The first whispers began among astronomers tracking its erratic brightness, as if the comet pulsed unnaturally, brightening, then dimming, then brightening again. To science, this could be explained by fragments breaking apart, releasing dust and gas. Yet, for the quiet observer, alone beneath the stars, the thought arose that perhaps the sky was signalling something. For thousands of years, comets were seen as omens. Even in the age of telescopes and data, there lingers a primal unease when an unknown visitor cuts through our heavens. Was 3IATLAS only a broken traveller, or something more deliberate, a reminder sent from the black? I remember the first time I read the data logs, numbers traced across the page like fingerprints of a silent guest. Its trajectory was impossibly long, stretching from beyond the familiar stars, crossing through our system as if guided by unseen hands. Some said it was chance, just another wanderer. But chance itself is an idea that often hides deeper truths. Why here? Why now? When our planet wrestles with its own fragility, when we too are at the brink of choices that shape our future? Was it simply coincidence that in this moment of human uncertainty, a messenger appeared in the sky? Think of the ancients who once stood where we stand, though without our science. They watched the same heavens, and each strange light stirred both fear and reverence. The Maya carved records of fiery stars that crossed their skies, linking them to endings and beginnings. The Chinese imperial astronomers documented comets with painstaking care, believing them to foretell dynastic shifts. In Europe too, a sudden streak in the heavens often meant disaster, or the passing of kings. Our ancestors believed the sky spoke, and though we smile at their myths, a quiet part of us still listens for meaning in the patterns above. 3IATLAS came quietly, without thunder, without prophecy. Yet it lingered in minds because of its difference. It was not born of this solar cradle. It carried dust from alien suns, frozen whispers from faraway origins. That alone makes it extraordinary, a shard of elsewhere passing near enough for us to notice. To see it was to glimpse the vast road beyond our cosmic neighbourhood, and perhaps to wonder if travellers sometimes leave signs on the road for others who may follow. Before we step further, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights dim. Maybe it's early morning with your first cup of coffee. Or maybe you're pausing between tasks and need something gentle to drift into. Wherever you are, imagine looking out your window and slowly stripping away the present world. No streets, no houses, no trees, only bare ground and open sky. If you enjoy this kind of quiet exploration and want more journeys into the hidden past, I'd be grateful if you left a comment or subscribed. It helps this space find others who might need the same calm escape. Now, let's step carefully into that world. For the more I stared into its story, the more I felt that 3IATLAS was not just an object, but an arrival. The word itself lingered in me like an echo. Arrival. Something deliberate. Something meant to be witnessed. It was easy to dismiss these thoughts as a trick of the imagination, the same way one might see faces in clouds or patterns in firelight. Yet, the persistence of the feeling gave it weight. I could not help but think of the way ancient navigators watched for stars to guide them, how travellers read the skies as one might read the lines of a book. Perhaps 3I/ATLAS in its brief visitation was a page turning before our eyes. Its path was unlike anything we had mapped before. While Oumuamua, the first interstellar visitor, had already shocked scientists with its strange acceleration, 3IATLAS followed with its own peculiarities. Fragments split from its body, glowing with uneven rhythm, almost as if it pulsed in response to unseen hands. Some researchers attributed it to structural weakness, ice vaporizing as it neared the sun. Yet, even those same scientists admitted the details resisted easy explanation. Its light waxed and waned with a pattern that did not fit comfortably into the expected language of comets. To me, it felt as though the object itself breathed, and breathing means life. That thought disturbed me more than it comforted me. Not life as we know it, but life in the sense of intention. We live within a universe we call vast and indifferent, but if indifference were the rule, then why did such a rare visitor cross paths with us at this exact moment in history? Each culture has carried the fear of warnings written in the sky, and though we tell ourselves we're beyond such superstition, the fear still stirs quietly beneath our rationality. Could this interstellar body be a reminder of the boundaries we too often forget? Could it be whispering that we're not as insulated, not as safe as we believe? I recall standing on a rooftop late at night, the air sharp and cold. The city around me was asleep, but above, the stars stretched endlessly. Somewhere in that infinity was 3I/ATLAS, gliding like a shadow across the void. It struck me that in all our searching for signs, radio waves, distant planets, the flicker of exoplanetary atmospheres, the message may not come as words or tones, but as presence. A sudden guest that does not linger but leaves us unsettled enough to ask questions we would otherwise avoid. Our ancestors looked at the heavens and saw gods. We look at the heavens and see data. Yet perhaps the line between them is thinner than we believe. The awe remains the same, the instinct to search for meaning when the familiar sky is disturbed. And perhaps the truest difference lies only in how we tell the story of what we've seen. The ancients carved their tales in stone and papyrus. We encode ours in digital traces and cold observatories. But the human heart beats the same rhythm. Awe, fear, wonder, silence. If 3I/ATLAS was only a comet, then it will fade, forgotten in the long record of icy wanderers. But if it was more, if it was a signal, or even just a mirror forcing us to see our own fragility, then its visit was not meaningless. It was the opening of a door, one we may not have even realised was there until it briefly creaked open in the night sky. And so I found myself haunted by the question, was 3I/ATLAS meant to pass unnoticed, or were we supposed to look deeper into its fleeting light? The more I turned this thought over, the more it gnawed at me, like a fragment of ice grinding endlessly against the edge of memory. It was not just about astronomy, not just the mechanics of celestial motion. It was about perception itself. How much of what we dismiss as coincidence is only our unwillingness to recognise design? The faint blue-green glow of 3I/ATLAS was reported by observatories around the world, but what struck me most was its inconsistency. Unlike ordinary comets, whose brilliance follows predictable patterns of solar heating, this one flickered unpredictably, as if it held its own rhythm pulsing like a beacon. Some compared it to the heartbeat of a dying star, others to the fractured breathing of something unraveling. Yet I could not resist the sense that it was closer to a signal, intentional in its irregularity, like an old lighthouse lamp shining across storm-tossed seas. I thought of the sailors of past centuries, guided through darkness by lonely beacons perched on cliffs. They too must have stared at a light through the void and wondered if it was fate or accident. The comet's strange luminescence felt like that. Something built not for beauty but for recognition. But recognition by whom? By us, standing with telescopes and sleepless eyes, or by someone else entirely far beyond, watching how we would respond. The deeper I read, the more unsettling details emerged. Its orbit, when plotted, was impossibly long, stretching back into regions of space where no human eye has ever lingered. It had travelled through the silence of galactic dust, surviving collisions, distortions, the gravity wells of unseen giants, until it crossed the fragile shell of our solar system. Out of all the directions it could have taken, why here? Why within the narrow window of our present, when humanity itself trembles between expansion and collapse? In quiet moments, I considered another possibility. Maybe it wasn't sent for us at all. Maybe it was simply travelling, and we were not its destination but its accident. To think of ourselves as the intended audience is a form of arrogance, yet the human mind is wired for stories, for centering ourselves in the plot. Still, what if this light was like a letter addressed to no one in particular, drifting across time, and we simply stumbled upon it, unprepared to decipher its meaning? There is a loneliness in that thought. Imagine standing in a vast desert, finding a shard of pottery, broken, eroded, the script on it half faded. You may not understand the language, but you sense the presence of hands that once wrote upon it. 3IATLAS felt like that shard, fragile and foreign, bearing hints of a civilization we cannot name, or perhaps not civilization at all, but forces of nature so alien they appear like will and intent. And still, I could not dismiss the unease that it lingered too perfectly in our time. The ancients once said the stars bent their will toward human destiny. We have learned to see the sky as indifferent, yet I wondered if we had only swung too far in our disbelief. If there are patterns woven in the heavens, then perhaps 3I/ATLAS was a stitch coming loose, reminding us of the larger fabric we belong to. The night I first truly grasped this, I dreamt of standing on an endless plain. Above me a pale green light pulsed, dimming and brightening as if it breathed. Each pulse sent a vibration through the air, like a whisper urging me to listen, to look deeper, to notice. I awoke with my heart racing, unsure if the message was mine alone or shared with all who dared to watch. And the question grew sharper in me. If 3I/ATLAS was a warning, then what exactly was it warning us against? To ask this was to admit that the universe could care enough to speak, or at least that something beyond us could shape a sign. For weeks I circled around this question, unable to let it rest. For every answer I imagined unravelled into darker threads. The most obvious fear was impact. History remembers the scars of celestial collisions. 65 million years ago, a body from space ended the reign of the dinosaurs in an instant, reshaping the path of life on Earth forever. Smaller impacts have echoed through time, fireballs brightening skies, explosions flattening forests. What if 3I/ATLAS was a harbinger, not the blow itself, but the herald of something larger following behind? A scout, perhaps, or a reminder written in ice that the cosmos can end us without warning. But the deeper fear was not destruction from without, but collapse from within. As I traced its strange light, I thought of the fragility of our own world. Rising seas, burning forests, shifting climates, the weight of our own hands pressing against the balance. Could the comet's erratic brilliance have been a mirror of our own instability, its fractured body echoing the fractures spreading silently through our civilization? In that sense, the warning was not about what the universe might do to us, but what we are already doing to ourselves. I remembered stories from ancient cultures where comets were said to carry disease, famine, war. To modern minds, those tales sound like superstition, yet symbols have power precisely because they touch the hidden truths we cannot escape. A comet appears. The world feels uneasy. 3I/ATLAS appeared, and we too stood in unease, though now it was not the wrath of gods we feared, but the quiet unravelling of our own making. There was also the unsettling thought that the warning was not even for us. Perhaps 3I/ATLAS was part of a message cast into the dark long ago, a signal meant for others, passing by us only because we stood in its path. If so, we were eavesdroppers, catching a fragment of a conversation far older and broader than our species. What would it mean to know that the universe is speaking but not to us? What would it mean to realise we were never the intended audience, that the words we strained to hear were never meant for our ears? Late one night, unable to sleep, I walked to the edge of a quiet field. The stars spilled over me, cold and indifferent. I tried to imagine what it would be like if the sky itself leaned closer, whispering. The wind brushed through the grass like a murmur, and for a fleeting moment I thought I could hear the comet's voice. Not words, but a vibration, a rhythm of distance and light. It was not a promise. It was not even a threat. It was something more haunting, a reminder that we are not beyond consequence, not beyond the gaze of the larger universe. Each time I thought I'd grasped its meaning, the idea slipped away, like trying to hold a fragment of ice that melts in your palm. Perhaps that was the warning itself, not a single message, but the reminder that we do not control the story, that even in an age of reason and science, the cosmos can still reach across gulfs of time and space to shake us with awe and uncertainty. And so I returned again and again to the same question, circling it like a moth drawn endlessly to flame. What if 3IATLAS was less a comet and more a message? A warning that our place in the universe is far more fragile than we dare admit? That question settled deep into me, carrying both dread and wonder. It was as if the sky itself had pulled back a curtain, letting us glimpse something too vast for words. For centuries, humanity has sought signs of life beyond Earth through deliberate channels, radio waves, probes, telescopes searching for a flicker in the dark. But what if the answer had come not as a reply, but as a presence, not in human language, but in the silent grammar of motion, light, and timing? 3IATLAS disintegrated as it neared the sun, its body fragmenting until only shards remained. To many, this was the end of its story, a fragile wanderer undone by heat. Yet to me, its dissolution felt symbolic, like a candle burning out the moment its light has drawn attention. It arrived, it glowed, it broke apart. Was that the message? That even the brightest visitors cannot linger forever, that endurance is not promised, even to those that have crossed eternity? I found myself recalling an old parable told in different cultures, the messenger who delivers the warning but perishes in the act. The Greeks had Hermes, winged and swift, carrying the will of gods and often suffering in his missions. In biblical texts, angels were said to appear suddenly, radiant, terrifying, and then vanish as quickly. Perhaps 3IATLAS was like that. A messenger not meant to endure, but to shock us briefly into awareness before returning us to silence. The scientific world continued to analyse fragments, debating whether it had ever been stable enough to survive long. But beyond the charts and spectra, I felt its story was still unfolding. Sometimes the most powerful warnings are not written in permanence but in transience. Like a voice carried briefly on the wind, fading just as you lean in to hear, forcing you to wonder what words were lost. If the warning was about cosmic vulnerability, the lesson was clear. The universe can reach us in sudden ways, and we are small before its power. If the warning was about our civilization's fragility, then the mirror it held was painful. We too fracture, we too burn out, we too risk dissolving into fragments of what once was whole. And if the warning was something else entirely, something beyond our ability to interpret, then the very act of trying to decode it became the point. To realise that there are signs greater than us, mysteries that resist our certainty, is itself a kind of awakening. There were nights when I thought of it less as a comet and more as a visitor, not alive in the way we know life, but carrying intention the way driftwood carries the shape of distant storms. Its journey may have begun before humanity even walked upright, and yet it arrived now, just as we gaze outward more than ever, just as we begin to test the edges of space with our fragile crafts. Could that timing really be nothing but chance? I remember sitting with maps of its trajectory, tracing the arc it carved across our system. It reminded me of an arrow, loosed from the void, missing Earth yet close enough to be seen. Not a strike, but a warning shot, a reminder that the universe can aim. Perhaps its path was random, yet random things can still strike with precision when viewed through the lens of meaning. For those who choose to see, the arrow's flight was not wasted, and so the thought returned again, heavier each time. If the arrow has already been loosed, then what comes after it? That image would not leave me. An arrow in the dark sky, not striking but passing close enough for us to feel the wind of its flight. And arrows, in every culture, are rarely loosed without reason. They are warnings, signals, or precursors of something greater that follows behind. The more I considered this, the more I remembered how deeply human history is tied to omens. From Babylon to the Maya, rulers would rise in the night to consult their star watchers whenever a strange light appeared in the heavens. For them, such arrivals were never empty. They meant change, upheaval, the breaking of old orders. What if, stripped of our modern arrogance, we could admit that the same might be true now? That 3IATLAS was not an isolated event but part of a larger unfolding, one we have yet to name. Some astronomers spoke of its disintegration as though it were a failed body, fragile and doomed. But what if disintegration itself was part of the signal? Breaking apart is a language too. Fragments scattering like seeds, leaving traces across space. Perhaps the warning was not in its survival, but in its ending, a mirror held up to our own trajectory. I imagined Earth viewed from afar, its lights glowing, its systems straining. Would we too be seen as a body beginning to fragment, glowing brighter in desperation as we drew near our own heat? At times the thought was unbearable, and yet I returned to it as if drawn by necessity. I thought of stories told around fires long ago, when sudden lights in the sky brought silence to gatherings. The fire crackled, the people whispered, and someone asked, "What does it mean?" We are not so different. Our fires are brighter now, our voices amplified by machines, but still we look upward and ask the same question. The strange brilliance of 3IATLAS seemed to pulse with that question. Not steady like a star, but irregular, restless, like a mind unable to remain still. Scientists measured it in magnitudes and equations, yet what lingered in me was the feeling of it, like watching a heartbeat across the heavens, reminding us of something living beyond our comprehension. If it was indeed an arrow, then perhaps it was not meant to harm but to prepare. In history, messengers often rode ahead of armies, carrying the news of what was coming. Could 3I/ATLAS have been such a herald? If so, then what was following behind it, hidden still in the distances of space? Something larger, something slower, something not yet within our sight. One night, I tried to imagine what it would be like to stand at the edge of the solar system, watching as this body entered, glowing faintly, carving its arc across the emptiness. The silence there would be total, the kind that hums in the bones, and then, from that silence, the object would pass like a lone traveller on a deserted road. You might never know who sent it, or why, but you would know you'd been seen. That is what unsettled me most, the sense of being observed, not by eyes but by the sheer precision of arrival. I traced its journey again, noting how easily it could have passed unseen, if not for our instruments, how brief its stay truly was. And yet, it was long enough to stir unease, long enough to leave its imprint in our memory. It did not come to destroy us, but neither did it come in peace. It came as a presence, neutral and yet charged with meaning, like a page turned too quickly to fully read, but too significant to ignore. The question grew louder. Was 3I/ATLAS the first page of a book we are only beginning to glimpse? If it was, then every flicker of light, every fragment of dust it left behind was part of a sentence we are too inexperienced to read. Books require readers prepared to understand them, and I wondered if humanity was still like a child staring at an alphabet, without grasping its meaning. The comet seemed to demand not only observation, but interpretation, as though our role was not just to measure its brightness, but to ask what that brightness was meant to stir within us. I thought of libraries, ancient and fragile, filled with words we still cannot translate, tablets inscribed in forgotten languages, papyri reduced to fragments. Entire civilizations have spoken and been silenced, their warnings trapped in symbols no one alive can fully understand. What if 3IATLAS was a library of its own, except written in motion and light, crossing the void with a message whose language we have not yet learned? If so, we stand as archaeologists of the sky, holding pieces of a shattered tablet, desperate to guess at its meaning before it is carried away by time. But if it was a first page, then the unsettling implication was that there must be more pages to follow. A story does not begin without intent to continue. That thought chilled me, for it meant 3I over ATLAS might not have been an isolated phenomenon, but a prelude. What if others are already on their way, slower, dimmer, still invisible against the background of stars? Each one a line in a cosmic sentence, spelling out something vast and undeniable. The possibility of continuity made me restless. Our history is filled with examples of warnings unheeded. Flood myths across the world speak of voices ignored before waters rose. Prophets in deserts spoke words dismissed until too late. Even modern warnings of climate, of war, of collapse are often drowned in noise until the consequences arrive. What if 3IATLAS was such a voice, clear yet fleeting, and we are already failing to listen? One evening, as twilight deepened, I stood by a river and watched the reflection of stars ripple on the surface. The water distorted their light, bending them into shifting forms, yet still they remained, shining steadily above. It reminded me of our perception of the universe, distorted, refracted, never fully clear. Perhaps the comet's message was simple, to remind us that what we see is not all there is, that beneath our distortions lies a truth, too bright to deny forever. There were scientists who dismissed these contemplations as romantic nonsense. For them, 3IATLAS was ice and rock, fragile, transient, governed by laws of physics alone. And yet, even within that dismissal lay something profound. If laws of physics alone produce this visitor, then is it not still a message? Does it not still declare our vulnerability, our impermanence, our inability to control what crosses the night? Whether intentional or accidental, the warning remains the same. We are small, and the universe is vast. But a darker thought grew with each night I traced its arc. If this was a page of a book, then what kind of book was it? Was it an epic of survival, urging us to rise and adapt? Or was it a tragedy, already begun, where warnings arrive too late to change the ending? Stories do not care for the comfort of their characters. They unfold as they must. Perhaps the comet was reminding us that we're not authors here, but participants in a story we cannot rewrite. And with that realization came an unease I could not silence. If 3IATLAS was the first page, then how close are we to turning to the next? The thought pressed against me with a weight I could neither shake nor resolve. Books do not pause for the readiness of their readers. Pages turn regardless of whether the eyes upon them are prepared. What if the universe, in its vast silence, was already unfolding a narrative, and we stood upon the threshold of the next chapter without realizing it? I imagined the sky as a great manuscript, written not in ink but in light and motion. Stars, planets, comets, each letter in a text too immense to grasp. For most of history, humanity read this book with awe, believing each streak and flare was purposeful. Modern science taught us to see randomness, to explain every detail with equations. Yet the equations do not erase the awe, they only name it differently, and sometimes, even within those equations, there remain gaps that whisper of intention. 3IATLAS existed in those gaps, in that uneasy space between certainty and wonder. when it fractured, pieces scattering into silence, I could not help but think of civilizations that once flourished and fell. The Sumerians, the Olmec, the forgotten kingdoms beneath desert sands. Their history shattered like fragments of comet ice, scattered across time, leaving us to piece together their meanings. What if 3IATLAS was a cosmic reflection of that truth, that nothing endures whole, that all stories break eventually, leaving fragments for those who come after to interpret? If so, then perhaps the next page will not be brighter, but darker, a story of endings rather than beginnings. And yet another part of me resisted. Fragments can be beginnings too. Seeds split before growth. Stars explode so that heavier elements may be born. Even the death of comets leaves trails across skies, showers of light that inspire awe for generations. Perhaps the warning was not only of danger, but of transformation. That fragility itself carries within it the possibility of renewal, if only we learn to see it. Still, I felt time pressing closer. Each night I stared at the heavens, sensing that silence was not absence, but preparation. If there was indeed a second page, it might not announce itself with grandeur. It could arrive as quietly as 3IATLAS, slipping past our attention until too late. That was the most chilling possibility of all. Not that the warning was ignored, but that the warning was invisible, written in a language we have yet to decipher. I remembered how easily history forgets its own warnings. Before great plagues, there were whispers of sickness. Before collapses of empires, there were murmurs of unrest. Each time those whispers were too easily dismissed until the flood had already broken through the gates. 3IATLAS was a whisper, faint and fleeting. What if we are already living in the moment before the gate breaks? I wondered too about the watchers, if such existed. Did someone, somewhere beyond our reach, send this fragment of ice and light as a message? Or was it simply an accidental survivor of another system's destruction, carrying its story into our view? Both possibilities are unsettling. One implies intention, the other implies chaos. Yet both converge on the same truth. The universe is not silent. It moves, it speaks, it delivers, whether or not we are willing to listen. The more I considered this, the more I felt that 3IATLAS was less about the comet itself and more about what it revealed in us. Our yearning for meaning, our fear of endings, our suspicion that we're not alone. It was a mirror held against our collective psyche, forcing us to see our fragility not just in cosmic scale, but in human scale. That was the true terror, not that something was coming, but that we were already unraveling beneath the weight of our own questions. And still, the silence above remained heavy, as though waiting. It was the kind of silence that presses against the skin, not empty but alive, as if holding something just out of reach. I would stand outside beneath the stars and feel it, a stillness that seemed to listen back. There is a difference between silence that ignores you and silence that acknowledges you, and this was the latter. It felt like standing before a closed door, knowing someone waits on the other side, deciding whether or not to open it. In that waiting, my thoughts drifted to other times humanity had believed itself chosen. The discovery of fire, the shaping of tools, the leap into flight, the first footprint pressed into lunar dust. Each was a moment we thought signalled a destiny. But what if this time the signal did not come from us, but toward us? 3IATLAS had appeared unannounced, travelled for unmeasurable ages, only to cross our path now. The probability staggered me. It was as if a stranger had knocked on our door after travelling endlessly through. Deserts, seas and mountains, arriving precisely at the hour when our house was most unstable. The comet's light, faint and trembling, seemed to burn deeper the more I reflected on it. If it was a warning, was it about something outside? A greater body? Another cosmic event? A storm yet unseen? Or was it about something within? Our world? Our people? Our choices unravelling like its fractured core? That uncertainty was its sharpest weapon. To be told danger is coming is one thing. To be given a riddle of danger is far worse. You begin to doubt everything, scanning shadows for threats that may not exist or may already be upon you. I remembered the way sailors once told of ghost ships appearing on horizons, their sails glowing with strange light before vanishing. Some swore these were omens of storms, others claimed they were echoes of the dead. Perhaps 3IATLAS was such a ghost ship, a spectral vessel gliding silently through the ocean of stars. Its broken hull spilled fragments like torn sails, yet its passage commanded awe, even fear. We did not know what flag it bore, nor what waters it had crossed, only that it appeared where none should. The silence of the sky, so heavy, made me think of pauses in stories, the moment before revelation, when the audience leans forward, breath held. Was the universe itself leaning toward us in that way? The idea was absurd and yet impossible to dismiss. We are part of the universe, shaped from its dust, moved by its gravity. If we sense meaning in its motions, perhaps it is not madness but recognition, like hearing a half-forgotten language echo in the wind. Each night that I returned to the question, I felt the same pull. What if the silence was not waiting for us to act, but for us to notice? Perhaps the warning had already been spoken, written in the very arc of the comet's path, and all that remained was whether we would acknowledge it. And what happens when warnings are ignored? History tells us again and again, collapse, disaster, loss. But sometimes, too, transformation. Out of fire, new forms rise. Out of ruins, civilizations are rebuilt. The silence above might not be doom, but invitation. Yet invitation to what? The stars flickered faintly in the river of night, but above them I imagined 3IATLAS continuing its journey outward, beyond our reach, beyond our knowing. It was gone, and yet its presence remained, as though some part of its passing had imprinted itself not in the sky, but in us. Perhaps that was the true meaning of the silence, not what waited above, but what had already awakened below. And I could not shake the growing fear that the next message might not come as gently. That fear coiled in me like a storm cloud, heavy with a charge that had not yet broken. 3IATLAS had entered quietly, dissolved quietly, left quietly. But warnings do not always whisper. Some arrive with fire, with thunder, with a kind of violence that no one can mistake for subtlety. I began to wonder if the comet had been the soft knock on the door, a final courtesy before something far greater demanded to be noticed. Astronomers often speak of probabilities, the odds of collisions, the likelihood of trajectories intersecting. They remind us that space is vast and the chances of catastrophe small. Yet the odds shrink when measured against eternity. Low probability ceases to comfort when stretched across infinite time. Somewhere in the unlit corridors of space there are other bodies, larger, darker, swifter. If one of them followed the same path as 3IATLAS, would we even see it in time? Or would the message it carried arrive not as light, but as impact? My mind returned to the Chicxulub event, that single strike which silenced the world of dinosaurs. For them, there had been no warning, no preparation, only sudden extinction. We, in our age, comfort ourselves with the belief that we can track the skies, predict threats, prepare. But what if the comet was reminding us of the truth we dare not face, that we are never as ready as we believe? The universe does not measure safety in human terms, and yet the possibility that unsettled me more deeply was not destruction, but contact. What if the next visitor does not come as rock or ice, but as something else entirely? 3. IATLAS had already bent the boundaries of our certainty. It was an interstellar traveller, carrying dust and ice from stars we have never seen, shaped by forces we cannot imagine. If such a body could reach us, what else might? Perhaps the comet was not just a warning of cosmic hazard, but a signal of presence, a reminder that the void is not empty, and that other hands may write in it. I recall a night when I stood alone, no light but the stars above me. The silence pressed close, and I felt for the first time the terror of recognition. It was not the fear of being destroyed, but the fear of being noticed. There is something ancient in us that shudders at the thought of eyes watching from the dark. Predators once stalked us in the night. Perhaps the sky still awakens that memory. 3IATLAS did not destroy us, but it did make us feel seen, and sometimes being seen is the beginning of danger. Still, there is another possibility, that the comet was not a warning of violence, but of choice. Warnings do not always precede disaster. Sometimes they precede decisions. If the message was that we stand at a threshold, then the next visitor might not come as punishment, but as test. What if the universe is watching not to end us, but to see what we will become? A fragile world on the edge of collapse, or a species capable of reading its place in the larger story. But fear gnawed at me. Gentle messages rarely repeat themselves. If we ignore the first knock, the second may not be so forgiving. Each culture has known this. Prophets silenced, omens dismissed, until the storm arrives with a force no one can deny. Perhaps 3IATLAS was the quiet voice. The next may not be so soft. And so I lived with a shadow in my thoughts, a growing sense that we were living in the pause before thunder. That pause stretched across days, weeks, lingering in every quiet hour of the night. I would look at the news, at the endless stream of human noise, and feel as though none of it mattered, that all our arguments and divisions were nothing but whispers before a storm none of us could stop. It was not a fear of the comet itself anymore. It was the dread of what might follow, and the recognition of how fragile we truly are. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of our species' vulnerability pressing down without mercy. We build towers that scrape the sky, machines that cross oceans, networks that link billions. Yet all of it could be erased in a single strike from the heavens, or even a shift too subtle to notice until it is too late. The thought hollowed me out. Beneath the veneer of progress, we are still the same fragile beings who once huddled in caves, waiting out the growl of predators in the dark. The predator now is larger, silent, and hidden in the fabric of space itself. But it was not only the vastness of destruction that troubled me. It was the question of meaning. If 3IATLAS was a warning, then someone, or something, had intended us to see it. That idea made me restless in ways I could not explain. Who would send such a message, and why would it come cloaked as a comet, disguised in natural form? Unless, of course, natural form is the only language the universe ever uses. I began to notice how much of my own fear was tied not to the comet, but to myself. I carried memories of mistakes, failures, choices that had fractured my own life. Each time I thought of 3IATLAS breaking apart, I felt a pang of recognition, as though the sky had mirrored my inner state. Fragile, unstable, glowing for a brief moment before falling into silence. Could the warning be personal as much as collective? A reminder that we, as individuals, carry the same fragility as worlds. The weight of that realization was suffocating. Nights became harder. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was filled with visions. I dreamt of standing in a vast hall of glass, each pane showing a different sky. Some skies were calm, filled with endless stars. Others were stormed with fire, comets streaking downward, earth burning beneath them. In one pane, I saw myself, older, smaller, staring back through the glass with hollow eyes. I woke trembling, unsure if I'd glimpsed the future or only the shape of my own fear. During the day, the world continued as though nothing had changed. Cars rushed along streets, screens glowed with distractions, people laughed in cafes, yet behind it all, I sensed the same shadow I carried. Perhaps others felt it too, but lacked the words to give it form. The The comet had brushed our sky, but its residue lingered in the psyche, subtle but heavy. It was like a whisper that everyone heard, but no one admitted aloud. And I found myself asking questions I had long avoided. If a warning comes, do we have the strength to act? Or are we destined to dismiss it, as so many civilizations before us ignored their own omens until collapse swept them away? The weight of history is cruel. Few societies have listened when the sky or the earth or their own prophets spoke of danger. Why should we be different? In those quiet hours, I felt myself torn between dread and hope. Perhaps the warning was not too late. Perhaps the pause before thunder was a gift, the space to prepare, to awaken, to change. But if so, we would need to hear it not as a whisper lost in noise, but as a call that shook us to our core. And in that fragile silence, I began to realize that the true storm might not be written in the sky at all, but in us. The thought unsettled me more deeply than the fear of any comet, for a rock of ice and dust passing through the void is beyond our control, but the storms within us, the chaos we summon, the fractures we nurture, those are born of choice. What if 3IATLAS was never about celestial destruction, but about the mirror it held to our species, reflecting the turbulence we try so hard to ignore? As I walked the streets, I noticed how fragile our world appeared beneath its surface. People rushed, screens glowed, machines hummed, but beneath it all was tension, political, environmental, spiritual. We speak often of progress, yet every day I saw signs of disintegration. Nations clashing, trust eroding, the very ground of our planet trembling with climate shifts. Was it coincidence that 3I/ATLAS fractured in the same era, when we too began to crack? Was the sky echoing what was already unraveling within us? I thought of Rome, of how it once seemed eternal, its power stretching across continents, and yet it fell, not from one single blow, but from 1,000 small fractures. Corruption, greed, division, denial. Each sign ignored until collapse became unavoidable. Perhaps the comet's crumbling was a reminder that greatness does not guarantee endurance. Even a traveller that survived the depths of interstellar space could break apart when it drew too close to the light. Are we any different? Drawn too close to our own fire, burning with ambition, splitting at the seams? The realization tore at me in ways I could not confess to anyone. It was not the universe that terrified me, but humanity, our inability to see the warnings, our insistence on dismissing signs until they screamed too loudly to be denied. What if 3I/ATLAS was not sent to frighten us with cosmic danger, but to remind us of our own blindness? The comet's voice was not thunder, but whisper, asking us, can you even recognize your own collapse when it mirrors mine? At night my dreams returned, sharper now. I saw great cities flickering like the comet itself, their lights rising and dimming as though in a slow heartbeat. Then they fractured, towers falling into silence. I woke drenched in sweat, my chest tight with a fear that seemed older than me. In those moments, I knew the comet was not just a scientific curiosity. It had carved itself into my subconscious, into the symbolic heart where omens dwell. And yet, even in that dread, there was a sliver of hope. For warnings, however grim, are not punishments. They are opportunities. A voice calling before the final silence. If the comet was a mirror, then perhaps it was also a chance. A reminder that fragility is not only a sentence, but also an invitation to change. We have seen collapse before, and yet we are here. Survival is stitched into us, even if blindness often walks beside it. Still, the question lingered like smoke after fire. Would we hear it this time? Or would the storm within us break free before we could even recognize its arrival? The silence of the skies was not empty, I realized. It was patient, watching, waiting for our answer. And perhaps the next chapter would not be written above, but within, in the choices we make or fail to make. The thought left me trembling, for it suggested something more unsettling than cosmic danger, that the fate of the world might depend not on stars but on us. That realization carried with it both terror and responsibility, a dual weight that pressed on my chest as I lay awake through long nights. For it meant the warning might not be about meteors or distant suns at all, but about our own reflection. If so, then the heavens had not spoken to doom us, but to remind us of the power we already hold, and the destruction we could summon if blind to it. I began to notice how easily we look outward when fearing catastrophe. We search the skies for threats, point telescopes toward the unknown, monitor the silence of space for whispers of danger. Yet rarely do we turn the same gaze inward. Humanity has always been skilled at projecting menace onto the horizon, less so at seeing the cracks beneath our feet. 3IATLAS, breaking apart as it neared the sun, felt less like a threat from beyond and more like a symbol of us nearing our own limits. Heat, pressure, fragility, all elements we live with daily, all forces we too may not withstand. In quieter moments, I thought of the ancient belief in correspondence, as above, so below. The sky was a mirror to the earth, and the earth to the sky. What happened in the heavens would unfold here in reflection. That belief, long dismissed as superstition, suddenly felt like the most rational metaphor of all. Perhaps we had not outgrown the ancients' wisdom. Perhaps we had forgotten it. The comet's strange rhythm of light returned to my mind often, the way it pulsed, dimmed, and flared as if trying to speak. Some scientists called it coincidence, others a trick of broken structure, but my heart whispered otherwise. Its uneven glow reminded me of a heartbeat, and a failing one at that. I thought of our forests burning, oceans rising, cities choking in their own smoke. Were we not too flickering, pulsing erratically, glowing brightly one moment only to falter the next? The reflection was impossible to ignore. I found myself withdrawing from conversations, from daily trivialities. While others laughed in cafes or worried about fleeting inconveniences, I kept seeing fragments of ice spiralling into nothing. The silence between people grew louder. I wanted to ask them, "Do you not feel it too?" The sense that the ground beneath us is less stable than we pretend? But such words would only be dismissed as paranoia, poetic madness. And so I carried them alone, a secret dialogue with the stars. And yet, it was not despair alone that filled me. For if the warning lay within us, then so too did the chance to change. Warnings do not arrive without purpose. A whispered reminder is always an invitation to listen. I wondered if perhaps 3IATLAS had arrived not to condemn us, but to ask, "Will you recognise yourselves before it is too late?" That question haunted me like a shadow at the edge of every thought. But recognition is never simple. It requires honesty, and honesty requires pain. To see ourselves as fractured is to admit fragility, to admit that our towers and cities and sciences may be as brittle as comet ice under a sun too strong. Few civilizations have made such admissions before collapse overtook them. Would we be any different? The comet was gone, already vanishing into silence beyond the sun, but its impression lingered like a scar. I could not shake the feeling that something within us had been seen, measured, perhaps even judged. And whether the judgment was mercy or warning I did not yet know. Yet in the quietest hours, when all other thoughts had dissolved, one image returned again and again, the faint trembling pulse of a dying light, mirrored in the trembling pulse of our own world. I could not drive it away, no matter how I tried. It lingered behind my eyes, in the space between waking and sleep, as if the comet had carved itself not only across the sky, but into the deepest layers of memory. Every flicker I saw in its passing light became a reflection of our own condition, as though the cosmos itself had placed a mirror above us, forcing us to look. It was then I began to think less of omens and more of mirrors. Throughout history, comets were said to announce change. But what if their true power was not in prophecy but in reflection? Each age sees in them what it fears most. To the ancients, war and plague. To us, extinction and collapse. The comet itself does not change. It is our own face shifting in its glow. 3IATLAS did not bring new fear into the world. It revealed the fear already waiting in our shadows. And yet, there was something different this time, something that gnawed at me with a sharper edge. Most comets belong to our system, circling in long, predictable paths. But this one came from elsewhere, an interstellar visitor. It was not bound to our sun, not written into our cycles. It cut across them like an outsider, carrying with it the weight of other stars, other histories. That foreignness was what made it feel more than reflection. It felt like intrusion, as though the mirror had not been lifted by us, but by something outside deliberately held before our eyes. In those nights, I would remember the old belief that messengers do not always speak in words. The sky itself can be a language. A falling star, a sudden eclipse, a comet's glow. These were never silent to those who watched carefully. And I wondered if we, with all our instruments and science, had grown so accustomed to dissecting the sky that we'd forgotten how to listen. Perhaps the warning was never in its chemistry or orbit, but in its timing. Arrival is itself a form of speech. The more I thought on this, the more I recognised how much we fear timing. Disasters always come at the wrong moment. Empires collapsed when they believe themselves eternal. A comet fractures when we are least ready to interpret its lesson. If 3IATLAS was indeed a page of some greater story, then its placement in our time could not be coincidence. It came when we were most fragile, most divided, when the pulse of our world wavered like its failing light. I began to sense that perhaps the comet was not only a warning of danger, but a test of perception. Could we recognise the mirror for what it was? Could we admit that its broken body reflected our own? Or would we dismiss it as coincidence, another forgotten fragment lost in the archive of astronomy? It felt like a question the universe had placed before us, waiting silently for our answer. And yet part of me feared what answer we might give. For if the comet had been alive in some sense, watching us as we watched it, what would it have seen? A species of brilliance and chaos, capable of art and cruelty in equal measure, wielding fire it cannot always control. Would it see us as worthy of further messages, or as a failed experiment, burning too brightly, destined to dissolve? The silence of the sky did not answer. It only watched, vast and unyielding, as if withholding judgment until the next sign appeared. And as the days passed, I felt more and more that the next sign was already on its way. That feeling grew inside me like a storm cloud, not based on evidence, not on data, but on a gnawing certainty. It was as if the silence of the sky was not a void, but a pause, a breath drawn before the voice returned. I could not look at the stars without sensing movement just beyond the reach of sight, as though something immense drifted there, waiting for its moment to emerge. This unease followed me through waking hours. Even the simplest things, the hum of a streetlight, the flicker of a reflection in glass, seemed to carry a charge of omen. I began to imagine the whole world as if it were leaning forward, bracing itself for an arrival. And in that tension, I noticed how easily people lived unaware, wrapped in their own lives. They could not feel the waiting in the air, or perhaps they felt it but chose not to name it. That blindness made the weight in me heavier. One night, I dreamt of a sky without stars, only darkness above, vast and empty. Then, from that void, a glow appeared, faint at first, then brightening until it filled the horizon. I tried to step back, but the ground beneath me fractured like glass. I fell through, into another sky, where countless glowing bodies crossed in silence, each one carrying its own secret. I awoke gasping, the echo of that vision clinging to me like frost. It was not simply fear of what might come. It was the certainty that what is unseen is already here. The comet had been the first signal, the whisper. What if the second sign would not be so kind? What if the next visitor did not arrive as light, breaking apart in silence, but as something heavier, undeniable? The ancients spoke of omens that came in pairs, the soft herald and then the strike, a bird landing on a wall before the city fell, a strange eclipse before famine. If so, then perhaps we were still only in the opening notes of a larger song. I tried to shake it, to ground myself in reason. I read papers, studied trajectories, listened to the voices of astronomers assuring that the skies are mapped, the threats known. But I could not rid myself of the conviction that what is truly significant does not announce itself on our terms. The universe does not consult human timetables. It arrives as it chooses, and we only pretend to be its masters. And so the fear became a companion, one that followed me into every silence. Sometimes in that stillness, I thought I heard something beyond sound, not a voice, but a pressure, as though space itself leaned closer. It filled me with dread and awe in equal measure. For what greater terror is there than to sense that the story is already unfolding and you are powerless to stop it? That was when I began to notice strange coincidences in my days, patterns repeating, numbers aligning, moments of déjà vu so strong they left me shaking. Was it only the mind, restless and searching, or was it another sign? The boundary between reason and omen thinned until I could not tell where one ended and the other began. The world itself felt fragile, a sheet of ice stretching over dark waters, each step a risk. If the next sign truly was approaching, I knew it would not arrive quietly. It would break the silence, shatter the pause, tear through the illusion of safety we cling to. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, a tension building toward release. The storm was not years away. It was near, so near I could almost taste it in the night air. And the thought that burned brightest, terrifying in its clarity, was this: the sky does not knock twice without reason. That sentence circled me like a shadow, each repetition heavier than the last. I began to imagine the universe itself as a vast cathedral, its silence broken only when the great doors creak open. A single knock, the first comet already felt monumental, but if a second came, it would not come idly. It would arrive with purpose, the kind of purpose that shifts destinies. I tried to temper these thoughts, to let logic smother them, but logic is often powerless against the pull of awe and fear. Even the most rational scientists, those who dismissed any thought of warning or omen, could not deny the strangeness of interstellar visitors. They were rare, impossibly rare. For two to appear within such a short span of human years was itself extraordinary. Perhaps it meant nothing. Or perhaps it was precisely the kind of alignment that demanded to be seen as message. During these days I felt a peculiar calm settle around my fear, as if the anticipation itself had numbed me. Instead of panic, there was a quiet, heavy waiting, like sitting in a darkened theatre knowing the curtain would rise soon. And in that stillness I began to think differently about what a warning really is. A warning is not merely a threat. It is a chance to prepare, a gift given before the blow falls. Maybe 3IATLAS had not come to frighten us, but to see if we were capable of listening. Yet when I turned my gaze inward, I doubted us. I doubted myself. Humanity often mistakes noise for signal, distraction for meaning. We chase light while ignoring shadow. Could we truly recognize a cosmic message if it were given? Or would it dissolve in arguments, in denial, in the endless clamour of competing voices? That doubt haunted me as much as the silence of the stars. One evening I walked along the edge of a quiet shore. The tide was low, the waves hushed, and above me the night stretched in infinite calm. And yet, in that calm, I felt it, the weight of something approaching, not in sight, not in sound, but in presence. It was the same feeling one gets when standing in the path of a storm before the wind begins, when the air itself feels thick, electric. The sea whispered of vastness, the stars shimmered with distance, and I stood small between them, aware that something unseen was already moving toward us. Perhaps the second knock would not come as a comet at all. Perhaps it would be something subtler, stranger, a shift in light, a distortion in time, an event that unsettles our perception rather than our skies. The universe has many ways of speaking. The danger lies not in its silence, but in the variety of its voices, most of which we may never learn to understand. I thought of the old myths again, how gods never appeared in their full form but in symbols: thunder, fire, storm, shadow. Not to deceive, but because mortals could not bear the truth directly. Maybe the universe is the same. It does not speak in words because we cannot yet comprehend words on such a scale. It speaks in signs, a fragment of interstellar ice, a trembling light, a sudden alignment. We are left to translate clumsily, through the lens of our fears and hopes. As I stood at the shore, the silence pressed closer, until even the sound of waves seemed distant. It felt like a breath held in the lungs of the world, waiting for release. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that the release would come, and when it did, the knock would be impossible to ignore. That certainty did not arrive like a revelation, but like a weight, slow and relentless, pressing deeper with each passing night. It was the sense that the air itself had thickened, that time had become taut, stretched thin as a thread about to snap. And in that tension, I began to feel that the question was no longer whether something would come, but whether we were prepared to face it. Preparedness, however, is a word we use too loosely. Nations build arsenals, scientists design monitoring systems, leaders speak of readiness, but beneath it all lies the truth. We are never ready for the unknown. To be ready requires knowing what to expect, and the cosmos does not offer us that comfort. It speaks in riddles, in fragments, in fleeting glimpses like 3IATLAS. The next sign would not arrive with clarity but with mystery, and we would be forced to decide what it meant before knowing for certain. This realization pulled me into a strange quiet. Instead of fear, there was a hollow patience, as though I too had become part of the waiting. I would sit for hours watching the night sky, searching not for comets, but for patterns. My eyes traced constellations, yet it was the spaces between stars that held me, the dark corridors, the voids that seemed to pulse with unseen motion. It was there, in that blackness, that I imagined the second knock already forming, already moving closer. Dreams returned often, and they grew more vivid. I found myself walking in endless halls where every wall was a mirror, and each reflection showed a different earth. In some, cities burned under falling fire. In others, oceans swallowed the land. In a few, the world was quiet, healed, green once more. Each time I tried to choose which reflection was real, the mirrors shattered, leaving only the silence of the void. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth, the kind of dryness that belongs to deserts or to space. The comet's disintegration replayed in my mind like a ritual, a body surviving eons of travel only to crumble at the edge of light. What if that was not its death, but its message? Perhaps the universe was not warning us of an external blow, but of internal unraveling, of endurance undone not by impact, but by exposure, by the inability to withstand the very forces that give life. If so, then the next knock might not arrive as destruction from without, but as revelation from within, exposing our weaknesses more brutally than fire or stone. Sometimes I wondered if this sense of imminence was madness, a private delusion grown from too much contemplation. Yet history tells of others who felt the same before great shifts, prophets wandering deserts, visionaries warning kings, mystics staring into fire. They too were dismissed until their words rang true. Perhaps the same silence that haunted me was pressing itself into others, scattered across the world, each of us carrying a shard of the same unease. And in that possibility lay a strange kind of hope. If the warning had been given, then perhaps the universe believed we could still act. The The next knock might be louder, undeniable, but it had not yet fallen. We were still in the pause, the breath, the space where choice lives. That thought steadied me, even as it terrified me. For choice is both gift and burden, and history has shown how often we squander it. Yet the silence continued, vast and unbroken, and in that silence the certainty deepened. The second knock was coming, and it would shake the foundations of everything we believed about ourselves. The thought wound through me like a thread, pulling at every part of my being. It was not a fear born of superstition anymore, nor even of celestial mechanics. It was a recognition, as though some deep part of me already knew the truth before my mind could name it. The next sign would not only alter how we see the universe, it would alter how we see ourselves. Each night I searched the sky, not with a telescope, but with my eyes, naked and vulnerable. I was not seeking data, I was seeking presence. I wanted to feel the weight of the stars pressing against me, to hear the quiet hum of existence that sometimes leaks through when the world is still enough. And in those moments, I felt small in a way that was both terrifying and sacred. The smallness that comes not from insignificance, but from standing at the edge of something immeasurable. The second knock, what could it be? My mind turned over possibilities. Another interstellar body, darker, larger, hidden in the corridors of the void until the last moment. Or perhaps something subtler, a signal disguised in starlight, patterns repeating across distances so vast we mistake them for noise. Or maybe it would not be seen at all but felt, a shift in the balance of our world, the quiet cracking of the systems we depend upon, like the slow fracture of ice before it plunges into the sea. Whatever form it might take, I sensed it would not allow us the comfort of dismissal. 3IATLAS could be ignored by most, a curiosity for astronomers, a passing story in the news. But the second would not pass unnoticed. It would demand attention, insist upon meaning, force us to confront truths we have long avoided. And in that confrontation, something in us would break, or something in us would awaken. There were nights when I imagined it as a figure at the threshold, hand poised against the door. The first knock had been soft, almost tentative. The second would not be. It would strike with authority, with finality, and when the door swung open, the world would no longer be the same. What lay beyond that door, could not imagine clearly, but I felt its gravity, pulling me even in my uncertainty. Dreams deepened with this imagery. I saw the earth as a fragile glass sphere, suspended in the void. The first knock cracked it faintly, a fissure spreading but not shattering. The second blow, however, split it wider, like bleeding out through the fractures, and through those openings something poured in, not fire, not destruction, but a light so alien it filled me with awe and terror alike. It was not an ending I saw, but a transformation, one that demanded surrender of everything we had clung to. When I woke from such visions, I would sit in silence, trembling, unable to decide if they were warnings or promises. Perhaps they were both. Warnings and promises often share the same face, depending on whether one chooses to resist or to yield. The comet had already left its mark in me, teaching me that messages can arrive disguised as accidents. The second knock, I sensed, would come as revelation, and we would have no disguise left to shield us. And so the silence stretched, heavy, like a held breath. Somewhere in that stillness, I felt the unseen hand already lifting to strike. The weight of it pressed on me like the air before lightning, thick with tension, trembling with invisible power. I found myself glancing more often at the skies, not searching for comets this time, but for the faintest sign of disturbance. A light where there should be none, a shadow that did not belong. It was not astronomy anymore, it was instinct, old and primal, the same instinct that made our ancestors look up from their fires when a predator moved beyond the edge of the dark. And in that waiting, a revelation formed in me. Perhaps the comet had not been warning of something external at all. Perhaps it had been warning of this. the pause, the silence, the anticipation that breaks the spirit before any blow falls. Humanity does not collapse only from impact. It collapses from fear, from division, from the erosion of belief. What if the comet was not a threat but a seed, planted in our collective mind, its roots spreading through unease until we fracture under the weight of our own imagination? The thought chilled me, for history holds many examples where fear destroyed what no enemy could. Cities abandoned because of whispers of plague, even when no disease had yet arrived. Armies defeated by panic before a single sword was drawn. Perhaps the true power of signs is not in what they are, but in what we make of them. 3. IATLAS had entered our system, broken apart and left, yet its shadow remained, heavy, shaping thought, shaping dread. The hand I felt lifting in the silence may not belong to the universe at all, but to us. Still, I could not dismiss the possibility of something larger. I recalled the way the ancients spoke of cycles, the belief that time itself moved in great spirals rather than lines. Golden ages rising, collapsing into darkness, only to rise again. What if 3IATLAS was a reminder that our place in that spiral is precarious, that we are nearing a bend we cannot yet see? The second knock, then, might not be a comet, not even an object, but the unfolding of a cycle, one that demands endings before it allows beginnings. As these thoughts deepened, I felt the boundaries between inner and outer blur. My dreams returned, vivid and relentless. In one, I stood on a cliff above an endless ocean. The waters below churned, not with waves, but with stars, as though the sky itself had sunk beneath the sea. From the depths, something vast began to rise, faceless and silent, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. I could not run. I could only stand, trembling, as it reached toward the surface. When I awoke, my body felt as though it had been touched by that enormity, my skin cold, my heart unsteady. Was the second knock already here, hidden in the way the world trembles without explanation? Storms growing fiercer, seasons shifting, forests falling silent. Or was that simply our doing, our hand-shaping destruction we do not wish to claim? The more I thought, the more the line blurred. Cosmic warning, human consequence, universal pattern. They merged until I could not tell one from the other. Perhaps they were never separate. Perhaps the message of the sky is always woven with the state of the earth. And so the silence grew heavier still, pressing not only above but within. The unseen hand lifted higher, and I knew it would fall. But whether it was the hand of the universe or the hand of humanity against itself, I could no longer say. That uncertainty was the most unbearable of all. If danger comes from outside, one can brace for it, build against it, prepare to endure. But when the danger is within, when the strike may be our own, then every choice, every silence, every failure to act becomes another weight dragging us toward collapse. I began to think of 3IATLAS not as an intruder, but as a mirror cast across time and space. It had carried its fragility with it across interstellar gulfs, only to crumble when it drew too close to the fire. Was that not the shape of our story? We too travel forward, brilliant but brittle, our momentum built on forces we do not fully control. We too edge closer to the fire of our own making, ambition, technology, pride. And we too risk disintegration when the heat grows too strong. Perhaps the comet's fall was not a warning of an external hand, but of the hand we already wield against ourselves. Yet a part of me resisted that explanation, clinging to the idea that there was intention beyond us. I imagined distant watchers, unseen civilizations, sending fragments of themselves across the void, not as weapons, but as messages. Perhaps 3IATLAS was a letter written in ice and light, and its breaking was the word it meant to deliver. Not destruction, but revelation. That all journeys end, that even the strongest travellers fall and that we are not exempt from that law. The question that consumed me then was simple but vast. Did the universe care enough to speak to us? For so long, humanity has searched for signals in the dark, yearning for proof that we are not alone. What if the proof was never in language or numbers but in timing and presence? A comet crossing just as we tremble in our own age of fragility. A shard of the infinite falling into our sight line, daring us to see meaning where others see accident. Perhaps the very act of noticing was the conversation. And yet, even as I entertained this thought, a darker one followed. What if the message was not meant for us at all? What if we were only bystanders, catching the edge of a communication never addressed to our world? A fragment crossing paths by chance, stirring questions it was never intended to raise. That possibility was more haunting than any direct warning. The thought that the universe speaks, but not to us, and that we mistake echoes for meaning. But whether message or mirror, omen or accident, the weight it left behind was undeniable. The silence after its departure was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of expectation. The air before thunder. The pause before doors swing wide. I felt it in my chest, heavy, insistent, a certainty that the second knock was already on its way, even if I could not name its shape. And so I stood often in the dark, staring upward, asking questions the sky did not answer. Was the hand above about to fall, or was it already falling, hidden in the small fractures of our daily lives? Would the next sign come as fire, as shadow, as silence? Or had it already come, unnoticed, while we argued about lesser things? The comet had been a messenger, but the message, I feared, was not yet complete. That thought lay on me like a stone, unmoving, impossible to shake free. If the words of the universe were written across the sky, then what I had seen was only the opening line, a fragment of a sentence torn from its larger whole. And the most haunting part was the certainty that the rest of the message was still coming, written in movements we'd not yet learned to interpret. I began to look differently at the world around me. Every small disruption, a sudden storm, an unexpected silence, the flicker of a light, seemed charged with meaning. It was as though reality itself had thinned, and through its cracks the pulse of a larger truth seeped. The comet had been an interloper, a wanderer from beyond our system. But what it left behind was not just dust in space. It left behind a kind of awareness, a crack in the armour of certainty, and through that crack seeped questions too large to dismiss. There are moments in history when perspective shifts so completely that nothing is ever the same again. The first time humanity saw Earth from space, suspended in blackness, a fragile sphere of blue. The first time telescopes revealed galaxies upon galaxies, endless and innumerable. 3IATLAS, I realised, had been one of those moments, though quieter, subtler, less obvious. Its silence was deceptive, but once felt, it could not be undone. The more I thought, the more I sensed that the warning was not only about destruction or collapse, but about readiness. Messages are not sent unless there is something to receive them. What if the comet had come to test us, to measure whether we were capable of seeing, of listening, of interpreting? And if we failed to listen, what would that mean for the next messenger? In ancient myths, the first herald is always dismissed. Cassandra in Troy, speaking truths no one believed. Prophets ignored until disaster struck. Perhaps we were replaying that cycle on a cosmic scale. Perhaps the universe had sent us its Cassandra, glowing faintly in green light, breaking apart before our eyes, whispering truths we did not want to hear. And like the Trojans, we risked dismissing it as madness, only to realise too late that it was the only voice that had spoken honestly. Sometimes I imagine the comet as alive in its own way, not in flesh or thought as we know it, but as a fragment of awareness, carrying intention shaped by forces beyond us. Perhaps its path had been nudged, its arrival not accident but choice, or perhaps even intention is the wrong word. Perhaps the universe itself breathes meaning into motion, and by crossing our skies, 3IATLS became a message simply because we saw it. Meaning, after all, is always born in the encounter, not the object. But the fear remained. If the message was not yet complete, then its conclusion was still approaching. Was it another visitor? A second traveller already on its way, slower but larger, waiting to emerge from the dark? Or was it an unraveling within our own world, the next phase of a collapse we were already living? My mind swayed between these possibilities, unable to settle, haunted by the knowledge that either way the silence could not last. I would stand at night by windows, staring out at a sky that looked unchanged, serene, eternal. And yet I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that serenity was illusion. The next line of the message was already written. The ink was drying in the void. We simply had not read it yet. And as I held that thought, one realization cut through me like a blade. Messages never arrive unless they are meant to be answered. That truth unsettled me more deeply than the comet's glow or its disintegration. For if 3IATLAS was indeed a message, then the silence that followed was not emptiness but expectation. It meant the universe had asked us something, and now it waited to see how we would respond. The terror was not only in the question, but in the possibility that our answer might already be unfolding, with or without our awareness. I thought of old rituals, how ancient peoples would watch the skies for omens and then act. Sacrifice, prayer, offerings, journeys. Anything to prove that they had seen and responded. To ignore a sign was to invite disaster, but we, modern and rational, pretend that silence absolves us. We note the comet, record its brightness, publish a paper, then move on. What if that very indifference is the answer we have already given? What if, in failing to recognise the weight of the sign, we have already declared ourselves deaf to the conversation? The thought hollowed me. For once a message is sent, it cannot be unsent. The silence after its passing is not forgiveness, but waiting, and what waits in the stillness may not be kind. I found myself considering what an answer could even look like. How does a species respond to a message written in ice and light? By changing itself. By listening harder, watching more carefully, finally learning humility in the face of the infinite. Perhaps our response was never meant to be words or signals, but transformation, to prove through our actions that we understood the fragility mirrored in the comet's fall. Yet, deep within, I feared the opposite, that our answer would be denial, arrogance, noise. We would bury the sign in distraction, mock those who saw meaning and carry on as if nothing had happened. And if the universe truly does listen, then what judgment could it pass upon a species that refuses to acknowledge what is placed directly before its eyes? Dreams returned, sharper now. I stood in a vast plain of stone, and before me towered an immense door carved with constellations. A voice without sound whispered, "Knock once, knock twice, wait for the answer." But I could not speak, could not move. The silence thickened until I awoke with tears on my face, trembling as though the dreamer demanded something I had failed to give. Perhaps the comet's message was simple, I thought later. Perhaps it asked only, "Are you listening? And if so, what do you hear?" That is all any messenger needs to know. Yet the simplicity of it was unbearable, for it meant that everything depended not on the comet itself, but on us. The universe had held up a mirror. Our answer lay in whether we dared to look. The silence stretched longer, heavier. Each night I looked upward and felt not peace, but the weight of an unanswered question pressing against the earth. It was as though the sky itself had asked something, and in our refusal or inability to respond, the question had thickened, becoming a presence. Silence is never empty. It grows, it fills, it demands. And now it seemed to have settled across us like an invisible veil, shaping thought, shaping fear, shaping dreams. I began to see signs not just in the heavens, but in the world around me. A bird striking a window and falling still. a streetlight flickering for no reason, holding its pulse like the comet once did, a sudden storm breaking across an otherwise calm horizon. Were these coincidences, or were they echoes of the unanswered message, rippling through the fabric of our reality? I could not tell. Yet each one seemed to whisper the same truth. Nothing remains silent forever. At times, I felt we were living inside a parable. The story of a people warned once and then given time. Time to change, time to awaken, time to listen. But the story does not pause forever. The second act always comes, and those who ignored the first sign find themselves unprepared for the next. That thought gnawed at me. The sense that 3IATLAS had been the first act, and now the pause was ending. I read again the accounts of its disintegration, scientists describing the comet's fragments scattering into dust. Some called it failure, a body too weak to endure. But I thought differently. Perhaps breaking was its message. Perhaps fragility is the only truth that survives the void. If so, then what it showed us was not its own weakness, but ours. We too are fragmenting. Nations, cultures, families, even the earth itself under our hands. What if that was the question pressed against us? Will you endure, or will you crumble as I did? The silence of the stars carried that weight. Each night I imagined them watching, not with eyes, but with presence, indifferent yet attentive, waiting to see whether we would fracture or rise. It made me feel both insignificant and chosen at once. For why should a fragment of ice and dust from another system pass by us now, of all times? Chance, some would say. But chance can still feel like intention when it arrives at the very moment it can be seen, when it speaks to the very fears we already carry. In dreams, the silence became a voice. Not words, not sentences, but pressure, like standing too close to the sea and feeling the pull of tides beneath your feet. I dreamt of the earth itself glowing faintly, pulsing in green light as the comet had done, its heartbeat slowing, flickering, nearly extinguished. Then the silence deepened until the world itself cracked open, and something vast stepped through. I always woke before I saw its face. Perhaps that is what unsettled me most, the knowledge that we're not merely waiting for signs, but already living within them. The realization clung to me like a second skin. It meant that the comet had not simply passed and left us to guess its meaning. It had altered the atmosphere of thought itself, leaving us to wander inside the echo of its presence. Signs are not always events. Sometimes they are conditions, changes in perception, shifts in the fabric of awareness, and once they arrive, they do not leave. I began to notice how silence itself had changed. It was no longer absence, but substance, a heavy weight settling over the world. I could feel it in moments of pause, between footsteps, between words, between breaths. It was as though the universe had pressed something into the gaps of our lives, something waiting to be noticed. And once I noticed, I could not unsee it. The silence was not void, it was question. In history, warnings often work this way. The tremors before an earthquake, the smoke before the fire spreads, the subtle shifts no one wants to name until the disaster is too large to ignore. Perhaps 3IATLAS was such a tremor. Not the catastrophe itself, but the sign that something deeper had already begun. A fracture too small to see, widening with every day. By the time it reveals itself, it will be too late to act. Yet, there was another interpretation that kept me awake at night. What if the comet was not warning us of collapse, but inviting us into recognition? The universe, after all, does not need us. It does not bend itself around our survival, and yet we exist, fragile and brief, within its immensity. To be offered even a whisper of awareness, even a glimpse of connection, is a gift. What if 3IATLAS was not doom but grace? A reminder that we are not alone, that the sky speaks, that the silence is never truly empty. This possibility frightened me more than doom, for doom is simple, it ends us. But invitation carries responsibility. To be invited is to be called. To be called is to respond. And I wondered if perhaps the silence pressing against us was not the shadow of disaster, but the demand for an answer. What will you do with what you have seen? What will you become now that you know you're not ignored? The ancient stories returned to me. Messengers from gods never arrived without demand. They did not appear for spectacle alone. They carried expectation. Abraham beneath the stars, Moses before the burning bush, Cassandra crying to deaf ears. What if the comet was such a messenger? And if so, then the silence following it is not neglect but patience. The patience of something waiting to see whether we can carry the weight of the message given. At times, I imagine the second knock not as fire or stone but as clarity. A revelation so undeniable that no one could dismiss it as chance. That thought both comforted and terrified me. For clarity changes everything. It shatters illusions, rips away the safety of ignorance. Once given, it cannot be reversed. The world before the message and the world after are never the same. And so I walk through my days with the silence pressing against me, shaping thought, reshaping fear. We were not waiting for signs. We were already inside them. The comet had been the threshold and now we had crossed. But if we had crossed, then the next step was inevitable. That thought followed me like a shadow through each hour of the day. It meant that 3IATLAS had not been an isolated wonder, not a fleeting accident in the heavens, but a threshold. We had stepped through it unknowingly, and now the path ahead was fixed. The silence pressing around us was no longer anticipation. It was momentum, carrying us toward a revelation that could not be avoided. I found myself returning again and again to the image of the comet's disintegration. A body that had travelled for ages, endured forces unimaginable, only to fracture when it drew too near to the light. Was this not the fate of all things? That endurance is only temporary, and light, whether knowledge, ambition or exposure, breaks apart even the strongest forms. If so, then perhaps the comet had been less a messenger and more a mirror, showing us the inevitability of our own trajectory. And if the next step was inevitable, then maybe it was not disaster we awaited, but transformation. The question haunted me. Is transformation a kind of death, or is it a new birth? In every myth I could recall, thresholds carried both. To cross was to leave something behind, often violently, in order to enter something greater. But rarely did those who crossed emerge unchanged. Were we ready for such a change? Were we willing to accept that to pass into what comes next we might have to let go of the world we know? I thought of how civilizations before us had faced such thresholds. When Rome fell, when the Black Death swept across Europe, when empires cracked beneath the weight of their own excess, each collapse was a threshold. For those within it, it felt like the end. Yet in hindsight, each collapse was also a beginning, birthing new forms, new worlds. Could it be that 3IATLAS had not come to warn of annihilation, but to remind us of this law, that endings are seeds? Still, fear gnawed at me. For seeds must first be broken before they grow, and I was not certain we had the strength to endure such breaking. The silence pressing against us felt less like a gentle pause and more like a gathering storm, one that would demand everything from us. And the inevitability of it was crushing. For we could not step backward through the threshold. We could not return to the world before the comet's passage. We could only move forward into whatever the next step revealed. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake listening to the hush of the world outside, and in that hush I imagined countless unseen movements. A dark body drifting toward us, a signal pulsing faintly, waiting for recognition. Or perhaps something stranger, something woven into the fabric of time itself, already unfolding beneath our feet. My heart would race at the thought that we were not simply awaiting revelation, but living inside it already, blind to its scale. Sometimes I wondered if the inevitability itself was the message, that no matter how much we resist, no matter how tightly we cling, all things must move toward change. Perhaps the comet had not been a question at all, but an answer. A statement written in green light and silence. This is the way of all things. And if so, then the next step was not punishment, but truth. The truth that nothing endures untouched. The silence of the heavens did not break. But I knew with a certainty that grew heavier each day. When it did, it would not be with whispers. That conviction nested in me like a living thing, growing, shifting, gnawing. I began to sense that the waiting itself was shaping us, pressing us towards some inner transformation long before any external sign would come. It was as if the universe had placed us in a crucible, and the silence was the fire. I wondered then if perhaps the next revelation would not arrive from the skies at all, but from within us. Humanity is drawn outward, always searching, always scanning horizons for answers. Yet perhaps the second knock would be inward, forcing us to confront truths we bury in ourselves. For what greater test is there than to hold a mirror before a species and watch what it chooses to see? 3. 3IATLAS had been such a mirror, a fragile body breaking under heat, reminding us of our own fragility. But perhaps the true revelation was yet deeper, that our fate lies not in comets or stars, but in the fractures we carry in our own hearts. The more I turned this over, the more I felt how thin the line had become between cosmic and human. Every silence above seemed reflected in the silences between us, nations distrustful, voices shouting past one another, truths hidden beneath noise. What if the comet's glow had been less about the universe speaking, and more about us refusing to listen, not to the sky, but to one another? That possibility left me breathless. For if the second knock came in this form, it would not be a comet, but a collapse born from within, an unraveling accelerated by our blindness. And yet, in the same thought, I felt a strange, trembling hope. For collapse and awakening are often the same motion, seen from different angles. To fracture is to reveal what lies beneath. Perhaps the silence was not a punishment, but an invitation, not to fear, but to hear. The question remained. Would we respond? Or would we, like so many before us, walk forward blind until the blow was undeniable? Dreams carried this tension into images. I dreamt of standing inside a cathedral of light, its ceiling endless, its walls shifting like waves. The silence there was not empty but alive, humming with unseen voices. In the centre stood a door, vast and closed, its surface pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I reached to touch it, and the silence deepened into a weight that made my chest ache. I woke gasping, certain that what I had touched was real, not in the world of stone and air, but in the deeper place where messages live before they take form. The inevitability of the second knock became not only fear, but expectation. If silence is a question, then it demands an answer, and unanswered questions always return louder. Perhaps this was the true rhythm of the cosmos. Not random events, but call and response, a dialogue we have only just begun to hear. 3IATLAS had spoken softly, and now the universe waited. What we do in this pause would shape the tone of the answer that follows. Each day I carried this awareness with me like a hidden fire. To others, life continued with ordinary rhythms, traffic, laughter, arguments, work. But for me, each moment was threaded with the awareness that we were being measured, not in numbers or equations, but in how we carried our fragility, in whether we chose denial or recognition. The silence was watching, patient, waiting for us to decide. And as nights grew longer and the stars burned cold above, I felt the inevitability tighten. The second knock would come, but whether it arrived as destruction or as awakening, that would depend on us. That thought was no comfort. It was a burden, heavy and relentless. To believe that our response could shape what was to come meant we could no longer plead ignorance. The silence pressing on us was not only warning, it was responsibility. I began to see humanity itself as a fragile bridge suspended over an abyss. On one side was the world we knew, with all its flaws, comforts and delusions. On the other side was something unseeable, a vast unknown waiting to be entered. The comet had shaken the bridge, made us aware of the drop below. Now, as the silence deepened, we stood still in the middle, trembling, knowing the crossing must continue but uncertain if the bridge would hold. The strange part was how ordinary life continued in spite of this weight. People laughed, argued, made plans, chased distractions. Perhaps this is how all great thresholds are crossed, not with universal recognition, but with only a few feeling the tremor, carrying it quietly until the moment when the world shifts for everyone. That thought frightened me. For if the silence had truly spoken, and only a handful listened, would that be enough? Or would the universe wait until all could hear, forcing the message louder, harsher, until denial was no longer possible? Dreams offered no relief. I dreamt of great bells tolling across a dark plain, their soundless chimes rippling through the air like waves. Each bell was a star, each toll a warning. But the people beneath them continued walking, deaf to the resonance that shook the ground. I alone stood listening, and in that isolation I felt the despair of a voice too small to carry. I woke with tears in my eyes, the silence of the dream echoing long after my body had left it. In my waking hours I wrestled with another fear. What if the second knock was not some distant arrival, but already here, unfolding in ways too vast or subtle for us to perceive? Perhaps the comet had not been a messenger of something coming, but of something present. Climate shifts, unseen cosmic alignments, the quiet unraveling of human trust. Were these not knocks in their own right? And if so, had the door already been opened without us realizing it? Yet amid the fear, there was a current of awe. To feel the weight of silence, to sense meaning pressing against existence, was to recognize that we are not abandoned in an indifferent cosmos. We are seen, measured, perhaps even called. And to be called is not a curse but a gift, however terrifying. The gift of being part of a story larger than ourselves. The comet's trail, the silence after, the waiting now. All of, it felt like threads in a tapestry we had only glimpsed. I carried this duality with me, fear and awe, despair and hope, knowing both were true at once, for perhaps awakening is always born this way, in the tension between collapse and renewal. The second knock would come, that much was certain. But how it arrived, and what it demanded, was still unwritten, and as the nights grew longer, I realized the silence itself was shaping me. I was no longer the same as before. I was listening differently, thinking differently, feeling differently. The message had already begun to change me. Perhaps that was the first step of awakening, to recognize that you cannot wait for the world to shift without shifting inside yourself. But if this was only the first step, then what lay beyond would be greater still, and far more difficult to bear. That thought lingered like a tremor, unsettling and undeniable. It meant that everything up to now, the comet's fracture, the silence pressing, the unease that stretched through nights, had only been preparation. What lay ahead would not be subtle. It would be the unveiling, the second knock, the revelation too vast a mistake. I began to imagine what form such a revelation might take. Would it be another traveller from the void, brighter, more undeniable, tearing across the heavens so no eye could look away? Or would it be a change in the fabric of life itself, something felt before it was seen, a shift in air, in time, in the pulse of existence? Perhaps it would be something so intimate, so close, that we would realize the sign had been with us all along, waiting for the moment when we were forced to notice. Dreams returned, but now they were sharper, heavier with meaning. I dreamt of standing at the edge of a vast desert where the horizon glowed with an otherworldly fire. A door rose from the sands, impossibly tall, etched with patterns of stars. As I approached, I felt the ground shudder, and the silence that poured through the cracks was unbearable, pressing into me until my heart felt it might burst. Then, with a thunderous pulse, the door began to open. I woke before I could see what lay beyond, but the sensation remained, that something immense had already stepped through. What if that was the truth? that the second knock was not future but present, already unfolding, and what we called silence was only our inability to recognise it. Humanity waits for spectacle, for fire and thunder, but perhaps revelation comes differently, not as destruction from without, but as recognition from within. The comet had fractured. Perhaps so must we, breaking open to see what lies beneath the surface we cling to. Yet fear still held me, for what breaks open does not always heal. Fragility is not only potential but peril. When glass shatters, it cannot be restored. What if awakening, when it came, destroyed more than it revealed? The comet had not survived its crossing into light. Would we fare differently? Or was that precisely the lesson? That some crossings demand sacrifice, that survival is never guaranteed. I thought often of the old stories, how gods disguised themselves in forms that tested mortals. A whisper in the wind, a stranger at the gate, a burning star overhead. The test was not whether mortals saw the spectacle, but whether they recognised the meaning. Perhaps 3IATLAS had been such a disguise, the first face of a truth too immense to reveal itself fully. And now, as silence stretched, the second face prepared to show itself. But what form could truth take that would shake us more deeply than a comet breaking apart across the void? The answer came to me one night as I stared into the darkness. It would not be what we expected. The second knock would not come in the form we sought. It would come as the thing we feared most, the thing we denied most fiercely, the thing closest to our own undoing. That was why it would be harder to bear, and in that realization I felt the silence shift. Not breaking, not yet, but leaning closer, pressing harder, as though the door in my dream had begun to open in waking life as well. What lay beyond I could not see, but I knew, with a certainty that froze me to stillness, that the second knock had already begun to sound. It was not a sound in the ears but in the marrow, not thunder in the sky but a vibration threading through thought itself. Once felt, it could not be unfelt. It was in the rhythm of the world, in storms that rose too quickly, in silence that lingered too long, in the way time itself seemed to stretch and tighten. The second knock was not coming. It was here. Yet what form had it taken? I searched for clarity but found only shadows. Perhaps it was not one event but many, weaving together into a pattern too vast to see at once. The comet had been a symbol, singular and undeniable. But the second knock felt diffuse, everywhere at once, spilling into all things. It was in the disquiet of nations, the unraveling of trust, the quiet despair threaded through laughter. It was in the trembling pulse of the earth itself. I began to see that the silence had never been absence. It had been the space in which this unfolding took shape. The pause before revelation is always deceptive. It feels like stillness, but beneath it, forces move, shifting the world into alignment for the unveiling to come. The second knock was not a comet or a signal or a single catastrophe. It was the convergence of everything we had ignored, everything the first knock had reflected, now pressing together into a single truth. Nothing can remain untouched. Dreams showed me this convergence in terrifying clarity. I saw the sky split open, not with fire but with light. A light that revealed, exposing everything hidden. It showed the fractures in us, the shadows we bury, the fragility of the structures we cling to. In the dream, people cried out, not from pain, but from recognition. For the greatest terror is not destruction, but truth laid bare. I awoke trembling, not because the dream had shown me an ending, but because it had shown me something I already knew. And so, the comet's message grew clearer, though it was not the clarity I wished for. The first knock had been the question, "Are you listening?" The second was the answer, "You cannot hide." In that revelation, I felt both despair and awe. Despair, because it meant the illusions we live in are destined to fall. Awe, because it meant that even in our fragility the universe finds us worth confronting with truth. I thought of the ancients again, how they lived in stories where God spoke through signs. They knew what we have forgotten, that the world is always speaking, that silence is never empty. Perhaps the comet had not been a messenger from elsewhere, but the universe itself reminding us of this truth. And now, in the second knock, we were being forced to remember. The thought settled heavily. The comet was never about the sky. It was about us. Its breaking was our breaking, its silence our silence, its return our reckoning. The second knock had already begun, not as an arrival from beyond, but as the awakening within. The world was shifting, and the only question left was whether we would resist or embrace the transformation pressing against us. And in that realization, a deeper silence fell, not absence, but fullness, as though the sky itself waited for us to speak. It was the kind of silence that did not leave room for avoidance. It pressed with expectation, like the moment before answering a question that has followed you too long, and in that fullness I understood. The comet had not been a warning of doom, nor a prophecy of destruction. It had been a summons. What summons could be greater than this? To awaken within a universe vast beyond comprehension, and yet to realise that our small lives were seen, measured, weighed. The silence was not indifference, it was invitation. And that invitation carried both terror and grace. Terror, because it meant that what we choose will echo beyond us. Grace, because it meant we're not overlooked, not lost in the endless dark. I thought back to the first time I saw its light, a faint glow, unremarkable compared to the brilliance of stars, and yet it carried something they did not. It was fleeting, fragile, a traveller who would not return. Its mortality mirrored ours, and in its fracture it spoke the truth no star ever can. That to exist is to be temporary, and yet within that temporality lies meaning. Perhaps that was the message all along. Not to fear endings, but to recognise the urgency of living before they come. The second knock, then, was not thunder or flame. It was recognition. The awareness that nothing waits forever, that silence is a question which demands an answer. We are already inside the revelation. The comet asked if we were listening. The silence asks if we will respond. And soon, whether with words, with choices, or with collapse, we will. In the stillness, I wondered what form our answer might take. Will we fall as it fell, scattering into fragments under the heat of our own creation? Or will we endure, not by denying fragility, but by embracing it, by recognising that to be fragile is not to be weak, but to be capable of meaning, capable of change, capable of becoming something more? I do not know. Perhaps no one can. The silence will continue until we speak, and the sky will wait, vast and patient, until we prove what kind of travellers we are. And so I return, night after night, to look upward. The stars burn cold, the darkness stretches unbroken, and yet the air hums with expectancy. Somewhere in that expanse fragments drift, reminders of what has already passed. And somewhere, perhaps already moving toward us, is the next messenger, the next line of the story, the next crossing we must endure. But for now only silence remains. Not emptiness, not threat, but a fullness waiting to be answered. And as I stand beneath it, I understand at last. The comet was not sent to warn us of the end. It was sent to remind us that we are part of a conversation far older, far vaster, and far more mysterious than we have ever dared to admit.